The city of New York had learned to smile on command. Beneath the towering billboards that stretched across Times Square, the faces of the seven gleamed with rehearsed perfection, each expression calibrated by focus groups and polished by lighting engineers, who understood that heroism, in this world, was simply another form of performance. Vought International had spent decades teaching the public how to cheer, when to gasp, and where to look. Every rescue was a scene. Every tragedy was a marketing beat. And every hero, no matter how bright their cape or how radiant their teeth, carried the quiet rod of an industry built on manufactured wonder. On this particular afternoon, a staged catastrophe was already underway. A hostage situation had been arranged in a downtown skyscraper, complete with paid actors, controlled explosives, and camera drones angled to catch Homelander in his most flattering light. He hovered above the street with his cape rippling in a wind machine's calculated breeze, wearing the smile he had practiced since childhood. Below him, crowds pressed against velvet ropes, phones raised, chanting his name with the fervor of a congregation. He inhaled the adoration the way a starving man inhales bread. Then the sky broke. It did not tear with the theatrical flair Vought preferred. There were no fireworks, no dramatic music cues, no branded lens flares. Instead, a jagged wound of violet light split the clouds, humming with a low frequency that seemed to press against the teeth of every witness below. For a single breathless moment, the crowd forgot Homelander entirely. They looked up, and they saw something the public relations department had not written into the script. A figure fell from the fracture. He struck the pavement with the force of a meteor, and the shock wave rolled outward in a perfect ring, shattering car windows and sending news drones spiraling into the sides of buildings. Dust rose in a slow, cinematic bloom. When it settled, a young man stood at the center of a crater, his blue and yellow suit torn along the shoulder. His dark hair matted with something that might have been blood or might have been stardust from a universe no one in this world had ever named. Mark Grayson lifted his head, and for a long moment he did not understand what he was seeing. The skyline was wrong. The air tasted wrong. Somewhere beneath the ringing in his ears, he could hear a voice through a loudspeaker announcing a rescue that no longer needed rescuing. He had been fighting a moment ago, hadn't he? There had been a weapon, a rupture, a scream torn from his own throat, and then there had been falling, so much falling. A child was crying. That sound cut through everything else. Mark turned toward it before his mind caught up with his body. A woman lay pinned beneath a section of collapsed scaffolding, her arm outstretched toward a small boy who had been thrown clear of the debris. Mark moved without thought, without pause, without any of the calculated hesitation the heroes of this world had been trained to perform. He lifted the steel as though it were paper, cradled the woman with the gentleness of someone who had learned, painfully, that strength could break as easily as it could save, and set her down beside her son. He did not smile for the cameras. He did not glance at the crowd. He simply asked if she was all right, and when she nodded, he moved to the next injured civilian, and then the next, and then the next. The crowd fell silent. It was a silence Homelander had never heard before. Not the hush of anticipation that preceded his own arrivals, but something deeper, something reverent, as though the people had accidentally stumbled into a church they had forgotten how to enter. Their phones were still raised, but the chanting had stopped. The cameras, which had been trained on Homelander for the entire broadcast, had all, one by one, turned toward the stranger in the crater. Homelander felt the shift the way a predator feels a change in the wind. He descended slowly, his boots touching the asphalt with theatrical precision, his cape settling around him like the closing of a stage curtain. He walked toward the newcomer with the practiced swagger of a man who had never, in his adult life, been asked to share a room. His smile was still there, still perfect, still lit from within by the terrible sunlight of his own need. But behind his eyes, something colder had already begun to calculate. The stranger did not notice him. That, more than anything, was what made Homelander's jaw tighten. The young man was kneeling beside an elderly gentleman with a broken leg, speaking in a low, steady voice, promising that help was coming, that he was safe now. He was covered in dust and blood, and the residue of a journey no one on this earth could have survived. And yet his first instinct had been to kneel. To kneel. Homelander could not remember the last time he had knelt for anyone. In a glass tower far above the street, Ashley Barrett watched the live feed with her hand pressed against her mouth. Around her, executives in tailored suits stood frozen, their coffee cooling on marble tabletops. The numbers were already climbing. Engagement metrics, social media impressions, trending hashtags, all of them spiking in real time around a hero who did not exist in any of their files. He had no contract, no brand, no merchandise, no Compound V paperwork, no Vought handler whispering in his ear. He was, in every measurable sense, an impossibility. And impossibilities, Ashley knew, were either the greatest opportunities of a lifetime or the beginning of an ending no one had prepared for. Down on the street, Mark finally rose to his feet. He looked around at the strange skyline, at the strange heroes, at the strange world that had swallowed him whole. He did not yet know where he was. He did not yet know what this earth had done to the word he had spent his entire life trying to deserve. But he knew, with the quiet certainty of a young man who had already lost too much, that people were hurt, and that was enough. Mark spent his first night in this new world on the roof of a building he did not recognize, watching a city that never quite went dark. The skyline pulsed with advertisements, and every third billboard bore the face of a hero. He had seen worlds with corruption before. He had lived in one, but there was something particular about this place, something in the way the light bent around the branding that made his stomach turn in a way he could not yet name. By morning, a woman in a charcoal suit was waiting for him on the rooftop. She introduced herself as Ashley Barrett, Senior Vice President of Hero Management at Vought International, and she spoke in the practiced cadence of someone who had rehearsed this conversation in a mirror. She offered him a chair he did not sit in. She offered him coffee he did not drink. She offered him, in careful escalating tiers, a life he had never asked for. There would be a penthouse in Manhattan, a stipend that made his father's old salary look like pocket change, endorsement deals with 3 major beverage companies, and a line of action figures that would be sculpted from a 3-dimensional body scan. There would be a personal publicist, a wardrobe consultant, a media coach, and a legal team that specialized in making inconvenient stories disappear. There would be a place among the 7, the most powerful and beloved heroes on Earth, and with it, the kind of fame that no ordinary person could imagine walking away from. Mark listened politely. He had been raised to be polite, even when he was uncomfortable, and Ashley Barrett made him deeply uncomfortable in a way he was still working out. When she finished, he thanked her. Then he said no. She blinked, as though she had misheard him. She smiled the small, patient smile of a woman preparing to renegotiate. She asked him what he wanted instead. More money, a better title, creative control, a solo brand. She could arrange anything, anything at all. She simply needed him to name his price. Mark told her that helping people was not something a person should have to be paid to do. He said it quietly, without judgment, without the sharpness that would have made the sentence a weapon. He said it the way his mother had once said it to him across a kitchen table, back when the word hero had been simpler, and the world had been smaller. Ashley Barrett left the rooftop without another word. By noon, the footage of Mark's rescue had been viewed more than 100 million times. By evening, editorial columns were being written comparing his composure to Homelander's smile. By midnight, a hashtag was trending that Vought had not authorized, and in the executive suites of the tallest tower in New York, a boardroom of very calm men and women were, for the first time in a very long time, quietly afraid. In a small apartment across town, Huey Campbell sat on the edge of a threadbare couch and watched the same footage for the 14th time. He kept rewinding to the moment the stranger had knelt beside the old man. There was something about that motion, something about the way the young hero had lowered himself without hesitation, that made Huey's throat tighten in a way he had not felt since he was a child, back when he had still believed that capes meant what the cartoons had promised. Beside him, Annie January stared at the screen with an expression he could not quite read. She had spent her entire adult life inside the machinery that manufactured heroes. She knew what a real one was supposed to look like, because she had grown up dreaming of becoming one, and she knew what a fake one looked like, because she had married the industry that made them. This stranger, this impossible young man from a crater in the middle of Manhattan, resembled neither. He resembled, she thought, the version of herself she had been at 15, before she had learned what compromise tasted like. She did not say this out loud. She only reached for Huey's hand. Across the river, in a bar that smelled of old beer and older grudges, Billy Butcher watched the same footage with an entirely different expression. His mouth was set in the flat, unreadable line of a man who had spent too many years being disappointed. He tapped the rim of his glass with one thick finger and shook his head slowly. "No one that powerful," he told the man beside him, "stays good forever." It was a rule he had built his life around. It was a rule that had never once let him down. The man beside him, a former Marine named Mother's Milk, did not disagree, but he did not agree either. He simply watched the young hero on the screen kneel again, and again, and again, and again, and thought about his own daughter, and said nothing. Over the next several days, Mark tried to understand this Earth. He flew above its cities and listened to its news broadcasts and read the strange glossy magazines that seemed to consider heroism a form of celebrity. He noticed things that troubled him. Rescues that seemed choreographed, damage that no one bothered to repair, applause that felt purchased. He noticed the way children looked at the heroes on billboards, and he noticed the way those same children looked at their empty refrigerators when they thought no adult was watching, so he began to help, quietly. Without cameras, without announcements, without the branded arrivals that seemed to be expected of everyone with powers in this place. He pulled a family from a burning tenement in Queens and left before the fire trucks arrived. He caught a bus that had lost its brakes on a hill in San Francisco and set it down so gently that the passengers did not realize they had been saved until they saw the shredded tire. He stopped a mugging in an alley in Chicago and asked the terrified victim if she needed him to walk her home. She said yes. He did. Stories began to spread. Not on Vought-approved channels, but on the small, stubborn corners of the internet, where ordinary people still traded ordinary miracles. A hero, they whispered, who did not ask for anything. In his tower, Homelander read these stories with a smile that did not reach his eyes. And somewhere behind that smile, a very old, very familiar rage began, very slowly, to wake. Autumn came early that year, and with it, a strange new weather pattern rolled across the country. Not storms, not floods, something quieter, something that felt, to those who noticed it, like the first breath of a season no one had lived through before. Mark crossed the continent in the space of a week. He put out a wildfire in Oregon by inhaling the flames into his lungs and exhaling them into the thin, cold air above the tree line. He rebuilt a levee in Louisiana with his bare hands while the rain hammered against his shoulders. He caught a commercial airliner as it fell out of the sky above Denver and set it down on a mountain meadow so softly that the flight attendants finished pouring the coffee. He did not accept interviews. He did not sign autographs. When people thanked him, he told them their names mattered more than his, and then he was gone. Social media, which had been engineered to reward spectacle, did not know what to do with him. So it did what it always did when confronted with something it could not sell. It made him a legend. The comparisons started small. A meme here, a comment there. Homelander's photograph beside a still of Mark carrying a child through smoke. Homelander's rehearsed speech beside a shaky phone video of Mark kneeling in the mud beside a farmer's collapsed barn. The captions grew bolder as the days passed. What if this is what a real hero looks like? What if we have been lied to? What if the man on the billboards was never the man we thought he was? Inside Vought Tower, the mood turned from concern to something colder. Ashley Barrett stopped sleeping. Stan Edgar, who had built the empire and understood better than anyone how fragile empires truly were, began holding meetings that did not appear on any calendar. The stock price wavered. The endorsement partners began asking uncomfortable questions. The senators who had once been so easy to purchase began, very quietly, to answer their phones a little more slowly. The seven began to fracture. Starlight watched Mark from a distance and felt something she had not felt since she was a girl in a Sunday school dress, staring up at a stained glass window and believing every story her mother had ever told her. It frightened her. It felt like remembering a language she had trained herself to forget. Queen Maeve watched him too, though she pretended not to. She sat in her apartment with a bottle of expensive whiskey in a cheap glass, and she watched the news, and she thought about the woman she had been before Vought had taught her that survival and integrity could not share the same room. She did not envy Mark his strength. She envied his belief. That, she thought, was the one thing they had taken from her that no amount of money could ever give back. A train paste. His whole life had been built on being the fastest. The idea that someone else could be faster, better, more beloved, more real, ate at him with an intensity that no amount of compound V could dull. He watched the trending charts and felt the specific, sickening dread of a man who had already been replaced once by his own younger brother and was now watching it happen again on a global scale. The Deep, ever desperate for approval, drafted a public statement praising Mark, deleted it, drafted another, deleted that one too, and finally posted a photograph of himself with a dolphin. It received 17 comments. All of them were cruel. Black Noir said nothing. Black Noir always said nothing. But those who knew how to read the small, careful stillness of his mask understood that he was watching Mark with a particular kind of attention, the kind reserved for storms. On a gray Tuesday afternoon in a diner off a stretch of highway in Pennsylvania, Billy Butcher finally decided he had waited long enough. He found Mark in a booth by the window, drinking coffee he had paid for, eating a slice of pie he had ordered like an ordinary man. The waitress had not recognized him. She had called him honey and refilled his cup and moved on. Butcher sat down across from him without asking, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Butcher had come expecting arrogance. He had come expecting the smug, hollow charm that every powerful man he had ever known had worn like cologne. He had come expecting to hate this stranger, because hatred was easier than hope, and Butcher had learned, a long time ago, that easier was almost always safer. Instead, he found a young man with tired eyes and dust in his hair, who looked up from his coffee and said hello. Butcher studied him for a long time. He asked questions, sharp ones, cruel ones, the kind designed to draw blood from any man with something to hide. Mark answered them plainly. He did not flinch. He did not perform. He did not try to convince Butcher of anything. When Butcher accused him of being a plant, a puppet, a Vought experiment gone rogue, Mark simply said no and asked if Butcher had lost someone. The question caught Butcher off guard. He had. Of course he had. He had lost the only person who had ever mattered to him, and he had built his entire life around the wreckage of that loss. He did not answer. He did not need to. Mark had already seen it in his face. Butcher finished his coffee in silence. When he stood to leave, he paused at the edge of the booth and said, without looking at Mark, that this world was different, that it ate good men, that it had eaten better ones than him. Mark looked up. Then someone, he said quietly, has to make it better. Butcher walked out of the diner into the pale afternoon light. He stood on the curb for a long time before he got into his car. He did not cry, because he had not cried in years and was not about to start now. But something inside his chest shifted in a way he did not have a word for. Somewhere in a tower in New York, Homelander was watching the trending charts, and the smile on his face was no longer a smile at all. The war began not with a battle, but with a headline. It appeared on a Sunday morning, buried in the middle of a reputable newspaper the way real venom is always buried, and it suggested in the careful, hedged language of professional insinuation that the mysterious new hero seen across the country might have been responsible for civilian deaths in an incident in Baltimore. There was footage, grainy but convincing, a figure that resembled Mark, standing above a collapsed building, a body count, a grieving family, a quote from an anonymous federal source expressing concern about unregulated superhumans operating without oversight. None of it was true, but truth, Mark was learning, had a slower engine than lies. By Sunday evening, the story was on every network. By Monday morning, congressional hearings had been proposed. By Tuesday, a poll showed that 37% of Americans now believed the mysterious hero was, at best, reckless, and at worst, dangerous. The number climbed each day. The footage, when independent experts finally examined it, was revealed to be a composite of 3 separate incidents, none of which involved Mark. But by the time the correction was published, on page 11 of a Wednesday edition no one read, the damage had already done its work. Mark sat on a rooftop in Cleveland and watched the sun set over a city that no longer knew what to think of him. He had never been hated before. He had been feared, briefly, in the early days on his own Earth, when the world had first learned what he could do. He had been misunderstood. He had been mourned. But he had never been the subject of a coordinated campaign designed to erase everything he was. The unfamiliarity of it settled into his chest like a low-grade fever. He did not know, yet, how to fight this. On his own Earth, the enemies had always been visible. A monster, an alien, a man in a mask with a weapon. You could see them, hit them, stop them. But here, the enemy wore a suit and worked from a glass tower and did not have a face he could put his fists through. Here, the enemy was a story. And stories, he was discovering, could bleed a hero long before any punch was thrown. Homelander, meanwhile, was not content to let the propaganda work alone. He engineered disasters, small ones at first. A gas leak in a suburb, a derailment in Kansas, a ferry stranded off the coast of Maine. Each of them had been arranged by Vought's black-budget subsidiaries, staged just far enough from Mark's known patrol routes to make his eventual arrival look delayed, incompetent, or worse, indifferent. Homelander watched the feeds with the patience of a man who had spent his life practicing patience only for cameras. Mark arrived at every one of them. He was faster than Homelander had accounted for. Faster than the reports had suggested. He pulled the ferry to shore with his bare hands. He sealed the gas leak with a pinch of 2 steel pipes. He caught the derailing train mid-air and set it down on the tracks so gently that the coffee in the dining car did not spill. Each time, Homelander added a new safeguard, a new layer of tragedy, a new orchestrated failure designed to make Mark look small. Each time, Mark saved everyone anyway. The propaganda began slowly to lose its footing. The public, which had been so eager to be told what to think, began in small numbers at first to think for itself. Reporters who had spent their careers on Vought's payroll began, quietly, to make phone calls they had never made before. A congresswoman from Ohio, who had received a very generous donation from a Vought subsidiary in the last election cycle, returned it. Starlight, in the middle of a rescue operation in Newark, found herself standing beside Mark on a collapsed overpass, holding a woman's hand while paramedics worked to free her leg. She had not planned to be there. She had told her handler she was attending a photo op. She had lied to her own security detail. She had come because she needed to know if he was real. He was. They spoke in the quiet moments between crises about heroism. She told him what it had cost her to become what she was. He told her, with the careful honesty of a young man who had lost more than he could name, that he had made mistakes on his own earth. Terrible ones. He was not, he said, a perfect hero. He was only a man who kept trying. She looked at him for a long time after that. She had never heard a hero admit imperfection before. Not in this world. Not on a rooftop. Not without a camera. Mark returned to the rooftop in Cleveland that night and sat with his knees pulled to his chest, and for the first time since arriving in this world, he allowed himself to feel tired. Not the physical exhaustion of battle, which he had known since he was 17, but the deeper tiredness of a soul that had begun to understand the true shape of what it was fighting. This world had not forgotten what a hero was. This world had been taught, deliberately, over decades, by people in tailored suits and boardrooms and marketing departments, to forget. Somewhere across the city, in a penthouse suite lined with mirrors, Homelander stood at his window and watched the skyline. The disasters had not worked. The headlines had not worked. The polls, which had briefly turned in his favor, were sliding back. And beneath his smile, which had not moved in 3 days, something older than rage was beginning to stir. Public humiliation, he decided, was no longer enough. He would need the world to watch. He would need every camera on Earth to be pointed at the same place, at the same time, when he finally taught this pretender what real power looked like. He would need a stage, a broadcast, a spectacle that could not be edited, spun, or buried. He picked up his phone. He called Ashley Barrett. He told her to arrange a press conference, a live global broadcast. Prime time, every network, every language. He wanted the mysterious newcomer standing beside him on that stage. He wanted, he said, to introduce himself properly. And when Ashley asked what he intended to say, Homelander smiled a smile that did not reach any part of him at all, and told her that words would not be necessary. The broadcast was scheduled for 8 in the evening, Eastern Standard Time, and by 7:45, more than 2 billion people were watching. Every network, every language, every screen in Times Square, Piccadilly Circus, Shibuya Crossing, and 1,000 smaller squares in 1,000 smaller cities where the world had learned to gather when Vought called. Mark had not wanted to come. He had known from the moment the invitation arrived what it was, a trap wearing the face of a conversation, a public execution dressed as a debate. He had known, and he had come anyway, because refusing would have looked like fear, and fear, in this world of manufactured narratives, was a weapon he could not afford to hand his enemy. He stood on the stage in a plain blue and yellow suit that had been mended by the kind hands of a seamstress in Cleveland who had refused his money. Beside him, Homelander wore his cape, his flag, his practiced smile, and the terrible stillness of a man who had already decided how the evening would end. Homelander spoke first. He always did. He addressed the world with the warm, paternal cadence he had spent decades perfecting. He spoke of safety, of order, of the sacred trust between a hero and the public he served. He spoke of the mysterious newcomer with sorrowful concern, as one might speak of a beloved brother who had, tragically, lost his way. He accused Mark, in the softest possible voice, of endangering civilians, of operating without oversight, of harboring loyalties to a foreign power, a foreign world, a foreign agenda that no honest American could support. The cameras drank it in. Mark listened. He did not interrupt. When Homelander finally turned to him and asked, with the theatrical grief of a prosecutor closing his case, whether he had anything to say for himself, Mark stepped to the microphone and said, simply, that he was sorry the world had been taught to fear the wrong things. He did not accuse Homelander of anything. He did not defend himself. He simply spoke, in a voice too quiet for spectacle, about the people he had met since arriving. The farmer in Louisiana, the child in Queens, the woman on the overpass in Newark. He named them. He remembered them. He said their names on a global broadcast the way a priest might name the dead at a vigil, and something in the sound of those ordinary names, spoken with genuine care, cut through the polished air of the stage like a blade through silk. Homelander's smile did not move, but behind his eyes the calculation shifted. He attacked. The punch came without warning, at a speed that had, for years, been the fastest thing on Earth. It should have taken Mark's head from his shoulders. It should have ended the broadcast, ended the debate, ended the young hero who had made the mistake of stealing Homelander's cameras. Mark caught it. He caught the fist in his open palm, and for a long, impossible second, the stage did not move. 2 billion people watched the tremor travel up Homelander's arm, watched the smile finally at last falter, watched the moment the most powerful man in this world discovered that he was not, in fact, the most powerful man in the room. Then the stage exploded. They fought through the studio, through the wall of the studio, through the building that housed the studio, and out into the streets of Manhattan. Every step Homelander took was aimed at Mark. Every step Mark took was aimed at the people between them. He caught a falling piece of masonry before it could crush a family in a taxi. He redirected a shockwave into an empty warehouse instead of a crowded restaurant. He pulled a construction worker out of the path of a car Homelander had hurled through a plate glass window without looking. Homelander was fighting to win. Mark was fighting to save. The difference, invisible to the untrained eye, became, over the course of that night, the most visible thing in the world. The cameras, which had multiplied by the 1,000 as every phone in the city turned toward the sky, captured it in every language, from every angle. They captured Homelander's snarl. They captured Mark's grief. They captured the way Homelander's blows landed on buildings, on cars, on anything that happened to be in the way. They captured the way Mark's blows landed only on Homelander, and only when there was no other choice. And they captured, 40 minutes into the fight, in a moment of terrible clarity above the ruined skyline, the sight of Homelander's blood. It was a small cut, a trickle from his lip where Mark at last had struck him. It was nothing. On any other man, on any ordinary night, it would have been a scratch. But this was not any other man, and this was not any ordinary night. This was Homelander, the invincible smile of Vought International, bleeding on live television for the first time in his adult life. The world saw it. The world could not unsee it. Somewhere in a bar in Brooklyn, a bartender who had spent his whole life cheering for Homelander set down the glass he was drying and did not pick up another one. Somewhere in a penthouse in Los Angeles, a Vought executive who had signed off on a decade of orchestrated rescues quietly opened a browser tab and began looking at flights to countries without extradition treaties. Somewhere in a small apartment in Queens, Huey Campbell sat on the edge of his couch and, for the first time in years, allowed himself to hope. Homelander felt it too. He felt the shift in the air the way a king feels the shift in a crowd. He looked at the blood on the back of his hand, and he looked at Mark, standing across the ruined street with an expression that was not triumph but something worse. It was pity. It was the pity of a young man who had once, on another Earth, faced his own father and learned what it cost to disappoint a god. Homelander could bear many things. He could bear humiliation. He could bear defeat. He could not bear pity. He rose into the sky before the finishing blow could come. He did not flee. Homelanders, in his own mind, did not flee. He simply, he told himself, withdrew, regrouped, prepared. But the cameras had seen the truth beneath the smile. The illusion of invincibility, which Vought had spent 40 years building, died that night on live television. And somewhere beneath the rubble, in the quiet after the storm, Mark Grayson knelt beside a wounded civilian and asked her name. The morning after the broadcast, the world woke into a version of itself it did not recognize. The stock market opened to the sound of screaming. Vought International lost 40% of its value before the closing bell. 3 of its largest sponsors terminated their contracts by press release. A congressional subcommittee that had, for a decade, been paid to look the other way, announced hearings that would begin within the week. In 17 countries, protests formed outside Vought-owned buildings before the sun had fully risen. In 3 of them, the buildings burned. Homelander did not sleep. He did not eat. He stood at the window of his penthouse and watched the city he had believed he owned begin to slip through his fingers like water through a fist. At noon, he made his choice. He appeared on every screen at once, uninvited, having simply seized the broadcast infrastructure the way a king seizes a granary. He wore his cape and his flag and his smile, but the smile had grown wrong overnight, tighter at the edges, thinner in the middle, the way a mask begins to crack when the face beneath it can no longer bear the weight. He announced, in the calm voice of a man announcing the weather, that the government had failed, that the corporations had failed, that the ordinary systems of law and order were no longer sufficient to protect the people from the threats that had entered their world. From this moment forward, he said he would protect them personally. He called it martial law. He did not use those words. He used softer ones: stewardship, guardianship, a temporary reordering. But every general watching, and every senator, and every citizen who had ever read a history book understood exactly what he meant. The 7 fractured that afternoon. A train fled. He simply ran at the speed only he could run and vanished into a life he had spent his whole career pretending he did not want. The Deep, sensing the direction of the wind, held a press conference in which he tearfully denounced Homelander, then held another press conference the same evening in which he tearfully praised him, then boarded a private plane whose destination he could not later recall. Queen Maeve walked out of Vought Tower with a duffel bag on her shoulder and a woman's hand in hers, and did not look back. Black Noir remained. Starlight did not. She found Mark in a warehouse on the edge of the harbor, where he had gone to think, and she did not ask his permission before she began telling him everything she knew. The names of the human experimentation facilities, the locations of the Compound V manufacturing plants, the list of politicians on the payroll, the list of journalists, the list of the dead, the ones Vought had disappeared over the years, whose files she had memorized because she had always known in some quiet corner of herself that this day would come. Mark listened. He did not interrupt. When she was finished, he asked her only one question: how do we stop it? She did not have an answer. But somewhere on the far side of the warehouse, a door opened, and Billy Butcher walked in with Mother's Milk and Frenchie and Kimiko behind him. And for the first time in a very long time, Butcher did not look at Mark with suspicion. He looked at him the way a soldier looks at another soldier before a battle neither of them expects to survive. He said, without preamble, that he had a plan. He said it was going to be ugly. He said it was going to require every dirty trick he had ever learned, and a few he was going to have to invent on the way. He said Mark was not going to like all of it. Mark said he did not need to like it. He needed it to work. Butcher smiled. It was not a warm smile, but it was a real one. And in the dim light of the warehouse, it looked almost human. They moved that night. They struck the Compound V facility in North Carolina first, because it was the largest and because Butcher wanted the symbolism. Mark tore the roof off the building with his bare hands while Frenchie disabled the security systems and Kimiko cut through the guards with the terrible, silent efficiency of a woman who had learned violence before she had learned mercy. Inside, they found what they had known they would find, and worse: children in cages. adults in tubes. Files, thousands of files, documenting decades of horror and the polite, bureaucratic language of internal memoranda. Mark carried the children out one by one, his face still, his hands steady, though something behind his eyes had begun to burn in a way Butcher had not seen before. By dawn, the footage was on every screen, not Vought's screens. Vought's screens were dark, but the smaller screens, the ones in the pockets of ordinary people, the ones on the desks of independent journalists and small-town anchors and grandmothers who had learned to record their own news. Those screens carried the footage across the world before the sun had fully risen. The world did not look away. Over the following days, they struck again and again and again. A facility in Nevada, a laboratory in Argentina, a senator's private residence in Virginia, where the safe in the basement contained enough documentation to end a dozen careers and begin 100 trials. Mark did not kill. He never killed, but he broke doors, and he broke walls, and he broke the polite fiction that the corruption of this world had been the work of a few bad actors rather than the deliberate, patient, decades-long project of an entire industry. Governments began to fall. Not violently at first, but the way old buildings fall. A crack here, a crack there, a ministry resigning, a cabinet dissolving, a prime minister boarding a plane and never arriving. The dependence of the modern state on Vaught's quiet influence, which no one had wanted to acknowledge, became suddenly, painfully, publicly undeniable. Mark realized, standing on a hilltop in the cold blue light of a morning that felt like the first honest morning in a long time, that the enemy had never been a single man. It had never been Homelander. It had been the machine that had built Homelander, and the machine that had built the machine, and the long, patient rot of a world that had, somewhere along the way, decided that spectacle was easier than truth. He was not fighting a villain. He was fighting an industry. And somewhere in a bunker beneath a mountain in Colorado, Homelander was gathering every remaining superhuman asset the corporation had ever created and preparing for a final, apocalyptic answer. They came at dawn. Every superhuman Vought had ever produced, every failed experiment, every prototype, every third-string hero who had been kept quietly on retainer for exactly this contingency, converged over the city of Washington in a formation so large that pilots in commercial aircraft turned their planes around without waiting for clearance. There were hundreds of them. Some flew, some ran, some walked, a few crawled. Homelander led them from the center of the sky, wearing his cape and his smile and the terrible calm of a man who had, at last, stopped pretending. They meant to take the capital. They meant to take the country. They meant, in the end, to take the world, because Homelander had decided that if he could not be beloved, he would be obeyed, and if he could not be obeyed, he would be feared, and if he could not be feared, then there would simply be no one left to feel anything at all. Mark met them alone above the Potomac. He had asked Butcher and the others to stay back, not out of pride but out of arithmetic. There were too many of them. The boys were extraordinary, and Starlight was radiant, and Maeve, who had returned that morning with a sword she had not carried since her Vought-approved television series, was as fierce as any warrior he had ever seen. But this was a fight in the sky, and only Mark could fight it in the sky, and only Mark could survive it. He asked one thing of them. "Do not let anyone die on the ground," they promised. The battle began at 7:11 in the morning, and by 7:12, the sky above Washington had become a thing of terrible beauty. Streaks of light, trails of smoke, bodies moving faster than the eye could follow, colliding in midair with the force of small bombs. Mark moved through them the way a swimmer moves through a strong current, deflecting, redirecting, disarming. He broke arms, and he broke jaws, and he broke the confidence of men and women who had spent their whole lives being told they were invincible, but he did not kill, not once. Not when they screamed for him to. Not when they laughed at him for refusing. Not when Homelander himself, hovering at the eye of the storm, told him that mercy was the last luxury of a dying species. Something remarkable began to happen. One of them stopped. A young woman in a red and silver costume who had been created in a laboratory in Cincinnati and had never known anything but Vaught's careful conditioning, hovered in the middle of the battle and looked at Mark and looked at the city below her and looked at the child in the window of the apartment building she had been ordered to destroy and lowered her hands. She simply stopped fighting. Then she flew down and stood between two Vought heroes and a hospital and told them, in a voice that shook but did not break, that she would not let them pass. Then another stopped, then 5, then 20, not all of them. Most of them kept fighting, because most of them had been made too carefully to change, and because Homelander's voice, ringing in their ears through the tactical earpieces Vought had never removed, was a very persuasive voice. But enough of them stopped, enough of them turned, enough of them looked at Mark and remembered, or perhaps discovered for the first time, that they had a choice. Mercy, it turned out, was contagious. Homelander watched his army fracture beneath him, and something inside him, something that had been fraying for months, finally, at last, snapped. He came for Mark then, not for the city, not for the country. For Mark, only for Mark. He came with everything he had ever been and everything he had ever been made to be. And the collision of their bodies above the Washington Monument was so loud that windows shattered in Baltimore. They fought through the sky and into the clouds and out beyond the clouds, into the thin, cold air where the curve of the earth became visible and the noise of the world dropped away into a silence Mark had not heard since he was a boy dreaming of flight. Homelander was faster than he had ever been. Homelander was stronger than he had ever been. Homelander was fighting without restraint, without calculation, without any of the carefully rehearsed poise that had made him a god on television. And in the freedom of that final abandonment, he was terrifying. But Mark was stronger. He had always been stronger. He had known it since the first punch on the stage. He had held it back, held it in, held himself together with a discipline Homelander could not begin to understand. And now, in the high blue silence above the world, Mark stopped holding back. He did not kill. He never killed, but he took Homelander apart piece by piece, blow by blow, with the terrible patience of a young man who had learned, on another earth, in another life, what it cost to become the thing he was fighting. He broke Homelander's arm. He broke Homelander's ribs. He broke, at last, the smile, and behind the smile he found, as he had suspected he would, only a frightened child who had never been loved. He set Homelander down on the roof of the Lincoln Memorial with something like gentleness, and he told him that it was over. Homelander looked up at him from the marble, his cape torn, his face streaked with blood, and something that might have been tears, and he asked, in a voice that no camera would ever again mistake for a god's, why Mark had not simply killed him. Because, Mark said quietly, I am not the man who taught you to be afraid. The world watched. The world had been watching the entire time on 10,000 phones and 100 networks and every satellite in low Earth orbit. It had watched Mark refuse to kill. It had watched Homelander weep. It had watched the illusion of 40 years dissolve in the high, cold air above the Potomac. And it had watched a young man from another universe kneel, one last time, beside a fallen enemy, and offer him the one thing Vought had never taught him to expect, a hand. Homelander did not take it. He was led away in restraints designed for men far weaker than he was, and he went quietly, because there was nothing left inside him with which to resist. But the image of the offered hand, freeze-framed on 10,000 screens, became the photograph of a generation. True strength, the world understood at last, was not the fist. It was the hand. Vought did not survive the winter. The corporation that had once written laws, deposed presidents, and dictated the shape of the modern imagination collapsed in the slow, undignified manner of all fallen empires. Executives were led out of glass towers in handcuffs. Assets were seized. Buildings were sold. The great neon sign atop the tower in Manhattan, which had glowed red for 40 years, was taken down on a gray afternoon in February, while a small crowd watched in silence, and no one, in all the city, could quite decide whether to cheer. Governments did not fare much better. Ministers resigned. Cabinets dissolved. Elections were called, and in some countries called again, and in a few, canceled entirely as the shape of what would come next remained too uncertain to name. There were tribunals. There were trials. There were long, difficult conversations in parliaments and congresses about how, exactly, a civilization begins the work of admitting it has been lied to for a very long time. Mark did not attend any of the ceremonies. He did not testify at the trials. He did not stand behind any of the new leaders as they took their oaths, though many of them invited him, and a few of them offered him titles he could not pronounce. He simply went to work. He rebuilt. He carried steel beams up the sides of half-destroyed apartment buildings while the tenants watched from the sidewalk with tears in their eyes. He cleared rubble from schoolyards with his bare hands so that children could return to classrooms that still had four walls. He flew concrete pillars from quarries to construction sites, and he set them down as gently as if they were sleeping children, and he asked no one for permission and no one for thanks. He wore the same blue and yellow suit he had arrived in, mended now in a dozen places by a dozen different hands. And he ate his meals in diners and slept on rooftops, and when a small boy in Detroit asked him for an autograph, he wrote his own name for the first time since he had crossed the rift, in careful, unhurried letters, and handed the notebook back with a smile that was neither practiced nor performed. Starlight became something the world had not, before, quite known how to name. She was not the leader of a new corporation because she refused to build one. She was not the head of a government because she refused to run for one. She was something older than either, something the world had almost forgotten it needed. She traveled, she listened, she spoke when speaking was needed, and she stayed silent when silence was needed more. And in the slow, quiet months after the fall, she became the face of a new generation of superhumans who understood, at last, that accountability was not the enemy of heroism. It was the shape of it. She and Huey married in a small ceremony in the spring. Mark attended. He did not give a speech. He simply cried a little, quietly, at the back, the way ordinary men cry at weddings. And afterwards, he danced with the bride and told her that she was going to be extraordinary, and she told him he already was, and they did not speak of it again. Butcher, for his part, did not know what to do with himself. He had spent his entire adult life at war with an enemy that no longer existed. The corporation was gone. The man he had hated most in the world was in a prison beneath a mountain in New Mexico, wearing restraints designed by physicists who had never expected to design restraints for anyone. The wife Butcher had lost was still lost. The son he had discovered too late was still learning how to be a boy after a childhood he had never been given. And Butcher, who had been a soldier and a smuggler and a wrecking ball for so long that he had almost forgotten there had ever been another shape available to him, sat on the porch of a small house on the coast and watched the sea, and did not, for a long time, know what to do with the silence. He came to see Mark sometimes in the cities where Mark was working. He would sit on a curb and drink a beer and watch Mark carry beams. He did not say much. Neither did Mark. But once, at the end of a long afternoon in a rebuilt neighborhood in Pittsburgh, Butcher looked up at him and said, without looking away, that he had been wrong. Not about everything, but about the important thing. Not every powerful man became a monster. Some of them, against all the evidence Butcher had ever gathered, simply refused. Mark told him he had not been wrong to be careful. Butcher told him to shut up and drink his beer. Children, meanwhile, had begun to play in the streets again. This, more than any headline, more than any trial, more than any collapsing corporation, was the thing Mark noticed first. Children in the ruined blocks of Washington. Children in the rebuilt schoolyards of Baltimore. Children in the small towns of the Midwest, where Vought had never really reached, but where its shadow had lain nonetheless. They played games he half remembered from his own childhood on his own earth, and in those games they were not celebrities. They were not brands. They were heroes, the older kind, the kind that had lived in the picture books of grandparents who had grown up before the corporation had taught the world to forget. Mark watched them sometimes from rooftops. He did not interrupt. He simply watched, and he smiled, and he thought about the small blue planet he had left behind, and the family who was waiting there, and the young woman he loved, who did not yet know whether he was alive. And then, one evening in late spring, standing on a bridge over a river that had begun, at last, to run clean again, he felt it, a hum in the air, a vibration along his bones, a pressure behind his eyes that he had felt once before, on a rooftop in a city he had never expected to see. The rift was opening again. His universe was calling him home. They gathered on a hilltop outside the city on the last evening of spring, and the sky above them was the deep, unhurried blue of a world that had, at last, begun to remember how to breathe. Starlight came, and Huey came with her. Butcher came, and Mother's Milk and Frenchie and Kamiko came behind him. Queen Maeve came with the woman whose hand she had held on the day she walked out of Vought Tower, and she wore no armor, and she carried no sword, and she looked, for the first time in many years, like a woman who was simply happy to be standing in a field at sunset. A dozen of the young superhumans who had turned in the sky above Washington came too, standing at a respectful distance, their new, quieter costumes fluttering in the wind. Mark stood at the edge of the hill and watched the rift begin to open above him. It was smaller than it had been. It was calmer. It hummed with the low, steady note of a door that had been waiting for him to be ready. He turned to them. He did not know how to say goodbye. He had never been good at it. He had left too many people behind, on too many battlefields, on too many quiet afternoons that had turned out to be the last afternoon, and he had learned, painfully, that the words never came out the way you wanted them to. So he did not try. He simply looked at each of them, one by one, and he let his face do what his mouth could not. Butcher spoke first. Of course he did. He walked up the slope of the hill with his hands in his coat pockets and stood beside Mark and looked at the rift with an expression that was almost, but not quite, amusement. He said that he had been wrong. He said it plainly, without the softening tics of a man trying to protect his pride. He said that not every powerful man became a monster. He said that a few of them, in defiance of everything the world had ever taught him, chose, against every possible incentive, to remain kind. He said that he had needed to meet one, in the flesh, to believe it. He said, with the small, dry smile of a man who had not smiled often, that he was glad the one he had met had been Mark. Mark told him, quietly, that Butcher had saved as many lives as he had. Butcher told him, with the same small, dry smile, to shut his cake hole. Starlight came next. She did not speak much. She simply took Mark's hand in both of hers and held it for a long moment, and then she promised him, with the quiet steadiness of a woman who had learned, at great cost, exactly what her promises were worth, that she would guard the ideals he had restored. She would not let them be commercialized. She would not let them be diluted. She would not let the world forget, again, that a hero was not a brand. Mark believed her. He said his goodbyes to the others in turn. To Hui, who had learned, somewhere along the way, that ordinary men could stand beside gods and remain ordinary. To Maeve, who had discovered that survival and integrity could, in fact, share the same room, as long as the room was small enough and the whiskey was good. To Frenchie and Kimiko, who spoke to him in a language he did not know and did not need to know. To Mother's Milk, who simply shook his hand and told him, gruffly, to fly safe. Then Mark rose into the air. He hovered for a moment above the hilltop, looking down at them, at this strange handful of people who had begun as strangers and become, in the space of a single impossible season, the closest thing to family he had known on this earth. The rift shimmered above him, patient, waiting. He could feel his own universe beyond it, humming with the familiar frequencies of home. He could feel, faintly, the outline of a young woman named Amber, and of a father he had already lost twice, and of a mother who had never stopped waiting. He raised one hand, they raised theirs, and then he was gone. The rift closed behind him with the soft, final sound of a door being pulled gently shut, and the sky above the hilltop was, once more, only the sky. The wind moved through the grass. Somewhere below, in the city, the lights were beginning to come on. Butcher put his hands back in his pockets. Starlight leaned her head against Huey's shoulder. No one spoke for a long time. Years later, children would grow up in this world who had never seen a Vought commercial, because there were no more Vought commercials to see. They would grow up in a world where the word hero had been given back to them, cleaned of its corporate residue, restored to the older, simpler meaning it had carried before the tower on Fifth Avenue had learned to sell it. They would ask their parents, on rainy afternoons, about the stories. About the mysterious young man from another world who had appeared in a crater in Manhattan and stayed for a season and then flown home. They would ask if the stories were true. Their parents would smile and say that they were, and that they had watched it happen, and that they would remember it until they died. There would be no statues. Mark had asked, before he left, that there be none, and Starlight had made sure his wishes were kept. There would be no monuments, no holidays in his name, no merchandise, no films. There would be, instead, something rarer and more difficult to measure. There would be a habit, a way of looking at the world, a quiet, stubborn conviction passed from parent to child in the ordinary conversations of ordinary evenings, that power, at its best, was not a throne. It was a hand. And on the other side of the rift, in a universe he had almost forgotten how to want, Mark Grayson descended slowly through a familiar morning sky. He could see his mother's kitchen window from a mile up. He could see the light on. He could see, faintly, the shape of her at the sink, waiting, as she had always waited, for him to come home. He thought, as he flew, about the world he had left behind. He thought about the question every world, in the end, was asked, whether power would serve fear or compassion, whether strength would rule or protect, whether the ones who could do anything would remember, always, that the measure of them was not what they could do, but what, in the quiet moments when no one was watching, they chose. He smiled. Then he flew home.